This video will cover the oligopoly form of market structure. We'll describe the characteristics of an oligopoly. We'll discuss market concentration, which is a key component of an oligopoly market. And we'll discuss it via the Herfindahl Hirschman Index, better known as HHI. We'll compare and contrast oligopoly to monopoly and perfect competition briefly. We'll discuss the incentives to cooperate versus act in one's own self-interest via the prisoner's dilemma. And then we'll apply that classic game theory model of prisoner's dilemma to the oligopoly behavior. And then we'll discuss briefly explicit or formal collusion versus tacit collusion. Now, the characteristics of an oligopoly is that the market is dominated by a few big producers. These producers interact with each other strategically, and they could interact in terms of price, service, branding, so that this interaction becomes very important in describing this market structure, because what one firm does, the other one responds and reacts to. For example, if a business increases its price, then it's likely that one of the other big players will take a look at that very closely and respond appropriately given the circumstances. Examples of oligopoly are breakfast cereal companies like Kellogg's, Post, and General Mills that hold a significant amount of market share. Soda companies, Coke and Pepsi. Automakers like Ford, GM, Toyota, and Honda. Product differentiation is not stressed in the analysis of this firm behavior, although it may play a role. Products are usually similar. So when we looked at monopolistic competition, product differentiation and advertising was key. That's not stressed in this form of market structure, at least in the analysis. This form of market structure is obviously empirically relevant and observable. You can see these actions going on. So how do you determine or measure whether there's a few big players in the market? And why would there be a few big players in the market before we even discuss that? Well, the why is most likely due to increasing returns to scale. There's something about the business that allows for increasing returns to scale, that businesses can get quite large. Somehow their average costs, or that U-shape average cost, well, maybe it's sort of like an L shape. But maybe the bottom of that U takes millions and millions and millions of units per year or per month to produce before you hit the bottom of the average total cost curve. So there's some form of increasing returns to scale. Then the next question is, well, how do you actually know if an oligopoly is present? And that's a tough question, but there are measures to try to measure market concentration, and one of them is the Herfindahl Hirschman Index, HHI. That index is the sum. That's why you have sigma here. Sigma, the sum of the market shares in percent. So meaning, like, if a company has a 30% market share, you put in 30, not 0.30, 30. And then you take it to the square. You square it. It's the sum of the squared market shares. So the HHI index ranges from 0 to 10,000, because if you only have one firm, a monopoly, and you take 100 squared, it's 10,000. If you have perfect competition, in theory, then each business has almost no market share, or a very small percentage of the market share, and you're almost close to zero on the HHI. With monopolistic competition, recall that there's a lot of players in that market. It's competitive in that sense. Well, firms are trying to differentiate themselves. Yeah, that's true, but there's a lot of competition there, which is the competitive part. Then it's pushing closer towards zero. And then oligopoly, of course, now there's only a few dominant players, so the numbers start pushing towards 10,000, although it'll never be near 10,000, but it'll move in that direction. Now, the U.S. agencies such as the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission look closely at market structure and the amount of concentration that's in market structure. So they have very rough rules, and every situation is different. For example, because it depends on how many dominant players are there. What's a dominant player? Well, that's kind of subjective. Nevertheless, they have guidelines, I guess you would best describe it. Guidelines for the HHI. For example, you'd see that they would consider markets with low concentration to be an HHI of less than 1,500, moderately concentrated markets between 1,500 and 2,500, and highly concentrated markets above 2,500. So like I said, it's rare, you're just not going to approach 10,000 in an oligopoly market. So highly concentrated markets are, ballpark 2,500 or more. So the point of this is these agencies are looking to protect consumers, and they don't want two very large dominant playing companies, two dominant players in a market, to merge, because if they merge, they will have market pricing power, even more market pricing power than they have. So if you have low concentrated markets and some companies want to merge, well, it's probably okay. It probably benefits society because they'll get economies of scale and probably won't have too much negative consequences in terms of pricing power towards consumers. So you see how the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission are looking at this. They're looking at it from, should we allow various mergers and acquisitions to go through? The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have guidelines on mergers and acquisitions. In fact, the guidelines are called the Horizontal Merger Guidelines. And before I go further, you might ask, well, what's a horizontal merger? Well, the horizontal mergers are really what they want to focus in on, and that's why it's called Horizontal Merger Guidelines. But a good example of what a horizontal merger would be if Kellogg's and Post, the two big cereal makers, were to merge. That would be horizontal because they're in the same business, and when that happens and they're in the same business, then they're going to have substantial market power, which means pricing power, and most likely consumers are going to be hurt. Now, there could be some benefits to the merger through economies of scale and eliminating duplicate facilities, and that could be argued in the discussion. But by and large, a horizontal merger of two dominant players is likely to lead to consumers being hurt through higher prices. Before I leave this point, let me compare and contrast horizontal mergers with vertical mergers. Vertical mergers will not be scrutinized as much by federal agencies because it's generally not going to result in much pricing power. And so an example of vertical merger would be if Kellogg's decides to buy a farmer or decides to buy the distribution network, the system of getting wheat, corn, rice to its manufacturing plants. That would be vertical. So vertical mergers have to do with supply chain concepts, whereas horizontal mergers are associated with dominant firms with similar products. While the HHI index is usually applied to firms and looking at market power and concentration, we can apply it to countries. Let's see what we get when we apply it to the top cocoa producing countries around the world. And so here we have, in terms of metric tons, Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Indonesia are really the top three players. It's subjective. So should I look at the top 3 or 4 or 5? Yeah, like I said, subjective. I applied the HHI to the top 3, and I calculated an HHI index of 1841. So if these were firms, this would be a moderately concentrated market. Now let's move the analysis over to firms. So here we have the top chocolate bar companies in the U.S. by market share. We see right off the bat that Hershey and Mars are the dominant players. Between the two of them, they have 74% of the market share. If I decide, or we decide, to extend it for the HHI purposes calculations, let's say we go 3, we look at the top 3 companies, then we have an HHI of 2917, well above the minimum for a highly concentrated market. So this is a highly concentrated market. So if Hershey and Mars were to contemplate a merger, they might most likely be rejected because too much market power would end up resulting. In fact, they kind of have a lot of market power to begin with. But if there's a merger, it's going to be, the top firm is going to have 74% of market share, and the new HHI will end up being over 5,000. So that would be certainly a concern to the U.S. agencies. Now, let's step outside the legal and ethical constraints of reality and study the motives and games that dominant firms are likely to play in an oligopoly situation. So before we do that, let's review the characteristics of an oligopoly. So there's a few dominant players. They offer similar or identical products, and so they're set up to be interdependent in a sense. And so that's why these sellers are often referred to as players, and game theory comes into play. Now let's study the simplest of games for an oligopoly situation, and that's a duopoly, where there are only two firms in the market. So here we have the supply and demand schedule for this duopoly. We got quantity of gallons of water. It's a market for water. So we got gallons starting from 0 going all the way up to 120 gallons. We have price, and then we have total profit. For simplification purposes, we have marginal cost equals 0. Keep it easy on ourselves instead of trying to get tangled up in marginal costs. If we were in a perfectly competitive market, remember, price equals marginal cost. And so what would happen is price would start to approach 0, right? You'd be moving down into this area at the bottom of the schedule. So we are looking at a duopoly, but we're doing a thought experiment here and saying, well, what would perfect competition look like in this market? And that's where profits would approach 0 at the bottom of this table. Now with a monopoly would want to maximize total revenue, which would be the same thing as profit. And so where is profit maximized? Well, total revenue maximized. It's right in the middle of the table here. It's 60 units, 60 gallons of water with a price of $60. And the total profit in the whole market would be $3,600. Divide that by 2, and each player in the duopoly will have profits of $1,800. So for this monopoly to come about, the two companies would have to collude. Now we want to see what are their incentives around this collusion. So let's move on. And so let's take a look at the same schedule and ask what would happen if A, so we got seller A, cheats and produces 40 gallons instead of just the 30. So it increases its production by 30, and B stays committed to the 30 gallons. So A is going behind the back of B. The price would then be $50 because the total would be 70 gallons of water. And if you look at 70 gallons of water, that's associated with a price of 50. So if you hammer out the profits for each A and B, you'd see that A, the cheater, gets a little bit more income, a little more profit. 40 units times $50, that's going to be 2,000, so they're up a bit. B's profits go down a bit because they're at 30 units at $50. And then so the total market here is 3,500. It's a little lower than what we started out with at 36, or what they started out with at 36. Now what happens if A cheats even more and produces 50 gallons and B stays committed? So then the price goes down to $40. Why? Because the total of 50 and 30 is 80 gallons, and at 80 gallons the price is 40. So you hammer out the calculations for the profits of A and B, and A stays at 2,000, so A really doesn't pick up anything. B actually loses a bit more and is at 1,200, and the total market for this industry is only $3,200. It's dropping. Then we ask the question, what happens if A and B both cheat and each produce 40 gallons of water? And so they're cheating behind each other's back. They're not telling each other. So at 40 units each, they're producing a total of 80. That's a price of $40. And so they both share $1,600, which is a total of only $3,200. It's not optimal. So the relevant part of this table is right here. Here we have monopoly, or right here, a duopoly trying to act like a monopoly. And then what happens is you notice, they're moving in this direction. They're moving down, and they're moving towards perfect competition through their cheating aspects. So they have self-interests that start to move them towards a more perfectly competitive market. Obviously not perfect, but closer to a perfectly competitive market. So what do we see? The oligopolies tend to produce between perfect competition and monopoly. But as so when you have oligopolies in general, the more players, the closer you are towards perfect competition, by the way. So notice in the model that the person being cheated on must take a blind eye towards the lower price. In the real world, there's many factors and uncertainties that make the price a little hard to figure out and determine, because there's inventory and supply chain adjustments, there's actions of other producers, there's seasonal effects, changes in consumer taste, cost changes, all make the price a little slippery. In this example, it looks kind of obvious. Well, the price is dropped, then somebody's cheating. But and so that is true. But in the real world, it's not so easy to determine. So what do we conclude from this analysis so far with the duopoly? Well, one conclusion we can reach is that there's a bit of gamesmanship going on here amongst the few dominant players. Players are essentially locked into a game where they can either cooperate and try to act like a monopoly and control price, or they can act in their own self-interests. And if they act on their own self-interest, they tend to start moving towards perfectly competitive markets with an eye towards their own self-interests. Hence, there's what's called a prisoner's dilemma. And so there's a classic model in game theory called the prisoner's dilemma that tries to analyze these types of concepts. Once we cover the prisoner's dilemma, we'll move over and actually apply it to oligopolies. The classic prisoner's dilemma works something like this. There are two criminals. They just pulled off a crime. The police have apprehended them, and then they're in the process of separately interrogating them. The police don't have enough information or evidence for a full conviction, which entails an 8-year prison term for each, without a confession from at least one. So they need at least one confession. Okay? The police, however, have sufficient evidence for a 2-year prison term on each. If one criminal confesses but the other does not, the confessor goes free and the other gets a 12-year sentence holding out. Let's summarize this in the following. If the two criminals cooperate with each other, and that's important, the criminals are cooperating with each other, not the police. And they deny, so they each cooperate. They plan ahead of time to cooperate, and they each deny. They'll only get a 2-year prison term each. Now, if one confesses, but the other does not, the confessor goes free, and the other gets 12 years. If both confess, the criminals do not cooperate with each other, they each get 8 years. So the dominant strategy, the one that works best for an individual regardless of what happens in this prisoner's dilemma, is for each not to cooperate with the other. In other words, act in their own self-interest, cheating like we saw earlier with the duopoly. Now what I want to do is build a table, classic table you'll see on the prisoner's dilemma, and examine the situation and ask, where's the dilemma? So let's apply this situation to an example using Bonnie and Clyde. Classic example, they're the duo who in the early 1930s committed a whole slew of crimes. So let's fill out the table according to what's given in the situation. And look, if they both don't confess, in other words, they cooperate with each other, not with the police, but Bonnie and Clyde cooperate with each other while they're being separately interrogated, so implicitly they cooperate, they each get 2 years. Because the police have enough information to give them 2-year prison terms. Now, if they both confess and they don't cooperate with each other, they each get 8 years. And here's the interesting aspect. If Bonnie now does not confess, but Clyde does, Bonnie gets 12 years, and Clyde, because he confesses, gets 0 years and turns in Bonnie. And the same thing applies here. If Bonnie confesses, she'll get no prison term, and Clyde will get 12 years in total. So notice how I've set this up. I put the dashed lines here. You normally won't see this in most literature, but it means that, look, this is Bonnie's payoffs. So these are called payoffs often when you look at game theory. And so these two deal with Bonnie. These two deal with Bonnie. And Clyde are these two. And so I put the dotted line to show that that applies to him, and so does this one. And these two apply to Clyde also. So now let's look at the rationale behind what their decision ought to be. So first off, let's look at Bonnie. And Bonnie has a decision. Should she confess or should she not confess? Should she not cooperate or cooperate? And the way to do it is we'll block this off first. So when you start up top here, you block this row off, and you ask, what is best for Bonnie, given that Clyde has confessed or will confess? So it's, if Bonnie confesses, she'll get 8 years. If she doesn't confess, she'll get 12 years. So what's the better of the two outcomes? The better of the two outcomes is Bonnie should confess, because, you know, if Clyde confesses, she's better off out of these two scenarios. So she's looking at these two scenarios and goes with the lighter sentence. Now, what happens with Bonnie's decision if Clyde decides not to confess? She's looking and comparing these two terms here. Well, what's best is she should confess when Clyde does not confess. Now let's look at Clyde here, and the way to do it is block this off and say, well, what's better for Clyde? If Bonnie confesses, he gets 12 years if he doesn't, and 8 if he does confess. So it looks like 8 is better for him. And if you cover up the Bonnie confesses and you look at here, what happens when Bonnie does not confess? What's the better outcome? 0 or 2? 0. So what you have here is, for Clyde, the best outcome, no matter what happens, is to confess. So no matter what happens, Clyde should confess. And when it comes to Bonnie, no matter what happens, Bonnie should confess. So it's a bit like the duopoly we saw earlier. They should cooperate, and if they cooperate, they'll only get 2 years. But they're tempted. They're tempted to cheat, not to cooperate, and their best self-interest means that they end up moving and they're worse off. So they move in that's the dilemma. They're best off if they cooperate, but if they act in their own self-interest, then they actually are both worse off. And that's the dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma that Bonnie and Clyde face. It's the same type of dilemma that we're looking at with the duopoly. If they act as a monopoly and they cooperate with each other, they're in this space. If they cheat, they're in a space over here where they don't cooperate. Now, the difficult part of the aspect is when you look at the prisoner's dilemma, it's like a minimization problem. You want to minimize the prison term. But when you look at a duopoly and you look at oligopoly in a prisoner's dilemma form, obviously firms want to maximize either revenue or profit. And so you got to flip your brain a bit around to make the switch. A couple of notes around game theory on this. When you read this literature on prisoner's dilemma, you'll see that the confession for both Clyde and Bonnie is a dominant strategy. And a dominant strategy is the best strategy for each player in a game, regardless of the strategy chosen by the other. The situation we have here is often described as a non-cooperative equilibrium. And why is it called a non-cooperative equilibrium? They're working in their own self-interest. Each player does not consider the effect of the action on the other, and that's what's meant by a non-cooperative equilibrium. Let's review the dominant strategy definition, and in doing so, introduce the concept of a Nash equilibrium. The dominant strategy recalls a strategy that is best for a player, and that's the important point. When you look at a dominant strategy, it's best for a player, regardless of the strategy of the other player or players. In this example with Bonnie and Clyde, there's a dominant strategy for Bonnie so that regardless of what Clyde does, she should confess. And then the same goes with Clyde. It's possible you can arrange this payoff matrix so that in one place Bonnie should confess, and then in another place Bonnie should not confess. And that would not be a dominant strategy. Here's a dominant strategy because no matter what happens, she should confess. And Clyde should confess. But had the payoffs been changed around, it's possible that Bonnie in some circumstances should confess, in some circumstances not confess. And when that happens, you don't have a dominant strategy. Now, Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies. So you got to look at more than one person when you're looking at a Nash equilibrium. And so A Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies in which each player is making the best choice given the choices of the other players. So for a Nash equilibrium to exist, and that Nash equilibrium is right here, each player must not have an incentive to change their mind, given that the other party's situation is unchanged. So they move into this Nash equilibrium because they're making the best choice given the situation. That Nash equilibrium is suboptimal. It's not the best solution. The optimal solution is right here. But given their own self-interest, they end up moving in this direction. Now let's take a look at the water duopoly market we just looked at a few minutes ago and see if we can cast that problem into a prisoner's dilemma structure. Before we try to translate the duopoly water problem into a prisoner's dilemma payoff matrix, let's review the slides that we've looked at earlier. Here's the supply and the demand schedule, and quantity and price are listed. Total profit, recall, marginal cost equals 0. There's two sellers, A and B, but set aside the two sellers for a second. Let's assume for a moment that there is many players in this market. And if this was the situation, we'd be moving toward the bottom of this demand schedule because price would exceed marginal cost. Marginal cost is 0, and as long as price is a little greater than marginal cost, firms have an incentive to produce. And so if we're perfectly competitive, we're going to be basically approaching quantity of 120 gallons with a 0 price and a 0 profit for each competitor. Now, let's flip it around and look at the other extreme, and the other extreme would be, let's suppose there was a monopoly. If there was a monopoly, we'd be producing, it would be producing right in the middle of this table, quantity of 60 gallons, a price of $60 for a total profit of $3,600. Now, let's bring and introduce the two sellers, A and B. Okay, so there's another scenario, A and B, which is in the middle, obviously, of perfect competition with many players and monopoly of one. So we have just two. If there's just two and they cooperate, then they're going to act like a monopoly. They're going to sell 60 gallons in total for the market, which means they each sell 30 gallons. The price will be $60 a gallon, and they'll basically share this $3,600 equally, $1,800 each. Now, again, let's look at some scenarios that might happen. So the first scenario I have on the right here is what happens if A cheats and produces 40 gallons instead of the 30 and B stays at the 30. So now if there's 40 plus 30 gallons, that means there's 70 gallons right here, 70 gallons. Well, 70 gallons means it's a price of $50. So the profits will be, well, A is at that new 40 gallons at $50, it's $2,000 profit, and that's a bit more than $1,800, so that's beneficial for A. That's why he or she's cheating. And then B's profit actually declines a bit because the price has gone down. So they're stuck at the 30 gallons that they had agreed to, but the price has dropped, and so they lose out by $300. The total market now is $3,500. And so it's down just a little bit from what the total market was at $3,600. What happens if A goes a step further and produces 50 gallons and B stays at 30? Well, then the price goes to 40. And that's because we're producing 80 gallons. Well, at 80 gallons, we're right here. And the price is going to be at $40. And the total payoff in this situation will be $3,200. And here's the profits now. A's profits going to remain the same compared to what it did up here. A's profits remain the same at $2,000. So A doesn't really have an incentive to do this. And B's profits drop because the price drops even further, and so they're now in the $1,200. So my point is here is this scenario right here. We can cross this one out. Okay, so this scenario here is interesting. Now let's move on to this other scenario. What if both A and B cheat and each produces 40 gallons? They each produce 40 gallons, and that means the total is going to be 80 gallons. The price will be 40 right here. And in that case, the profits will be 1,600, and they'll share this 3,200 right here. But they're down compared if they were cooperating. So if they're cooperating, they would have made 1,800 each instead of just 1,600 each. So let's develop this payoff matrix. Here's A, and A can cooperate in this column or not cooperate and act in its own self-interest. B can cooperate or B cannot cooperate. We started off by saying, look, if the two cooperate, they act like a monopoly, you restrict output, and the price stays relatively high. Price was $60 and quantity was 30 units each. And then we said, what if they both cheated? And if they both cheated, they moved down the table towards perfect competition, and they get $1,600. They share $1,600 each in revenue, and the price is set at 40, and the quantity each is set at 40. And then we said, well, what happens if A cheats and sets quantity equal to 40 and sells 10 more? Then his or her profit will be $2,000, and the price, by the way, will now be $40. So they're moving closer. They're dropped down a bit. Price is $40. Quantity is 30 for B. B has a $1,500 payoff. Now, what happens if A cooperates and B cheats? Then B is going to get $2,000 with a quantity equal to 40. And here the quantity will be, because A is cooperating, they're going to keep the $30 quantity. The profits are going to be $1,500. P equal to 40 here. Now, given the scenario, let's see where the dominant strategies are, if there are any. Let's look at A first. Block off this row and ask yourself, what's A going to do here? Given that B is cooperating, should A cooperate or should A not cooperate? Well, it's the comparison of these two terms, and this is obviously the winner. So, given the situation at this point, if B cooperates, A should not cooperate. Now, let's look at what A should do if B doesn't cooperate. Well, again, we're looking and comparing these two scenarios, and these two scenarios says the more profits are associated with not cooperating. So right off the bat, we have a dominant strategy for A. Regardless of what B does, regardless, and this is part of the definition of a dominant strategy, then A should not cooperate. A should basically cheat in this scenario. Now we'll do the same analysis for B. And we ask, okay, given that A is cooperating, what should B do? Should B cooperate or not cooperate? It's comparing these two terms. This term is larger, so it's going to, B is going to not cooperate. Now, cover this up. What should B do? Cooperate or not cooperate when A does not cooperate? Well, it's a comparison of these two terms. Compare those two terms. Then what happens is, regardless of what happens, B should not cooperate. So therefore, the dominant strategy of A is not to cooperate. The dominant strategy of B is not cooperate. They're in this box. Here is our Nash equilibrium. It's a pair of strategies. Okay? Dominant strategies are for each individual player, but in this Nash equilibrium, it's the optimal strategy given what everybody else is playing. So there's no other place. So once they're in this position, there's no other move that can make them better off. And so they're stuck in this solution, which is suboptimal compared to if they were to cooperate. Now let's examine the welfare effects of this situation. To analyze the welfare effects I've carefully drawn out the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the total revenue curve just for some context of where we are in the problem. So notice the demand curve is pinned here to both axes. When price is 0, which is marginal cost equals 0, we're right at this point. And when price is 120, this quantity demanded is 0, we're right at this point. The marginal revenue curve is twice the slope of the demand curve, and you can tell because I set it exactly equal and right here. So that cuts it right down the middle, so that means it has to have twice the slope. And then when the marginal revenue equals 0 right at that point, you hit a flat spot on the total revenue curve. So let's start out and look at the surplus associated with perfect competition. Well, if we're in perfect competition, we've moved in this direction down to this point. We're approaching this point. And if we're approaching this point, then this is what people are willing to pay. It's the demand curve. This is the price they're paying, 0. All of this is consumer surplus. This whole area is consumer surplus. Now, let's look at what happens if they decide to collude. And they decide to collude, they're going to set a point where total revenue is maximized. Total revenue is maximized where marginal revenue equals 0. You come up, and then we're going to have a price right here of $60, which should be right here in the middle, and it is. So here we have a price of $60, and then at a price of $60, what do we have? We have consumer surplus here, because this is what people are willing to pay, and this is what they're actually going to pay. Then this is the price that the suppliers are going to get, this price. This is their marginal cost, so this is producer surplus. And what do you know? Here we got this blank right here. That's dead weight loss in that scenario. Now, remember, the Nash equilibrium was set at a price of $40. And at a price of $40, we're out here somewhere. And so we're somewhere between the monopoly situation and the perfect competition situation. And so here's consumer surplus. Everything above this line, this right here is consumer surplus. And then the producer surplus is right here. And then we have a smaller dead weight loss associated with the collusion. So consumers are better off in that scenario compared to if they fully cooperated. So what we're seeing here is that this 60 by 60 area here, that's producer surplus under the cooperation scenario, and that equals the total revenue and profit, 3,600, 60 times 60. And then when they cheat on each other, it's the 40 times 80, right? 40 times 80, because this will be 80 units. That ends up to be 32, so we come down, we're around 3,200 here. And what you see is the producer surplus is equal to the profits, which is equal to the revenues, all because we set the marginal cost equal to 0. Before I wrap up this video, let's talk a little bit about explicit collusion versus tacit collusion. In the video, I'm talking a lot about oligopolies and their collusion potential. And I want to point out that explicit collusion among oligopolies, or any firm for that matter, is illegal. It's not that common that it happens. It does happen, but it's not that common. But when it does, it generally makes the headlines, especially among the larger firms. The U.S. government has volumes of regulation that attempt to prevent or limit collusion. And if you take a course in a law program, this is the intersection of finance, economics, and law come into play. There's often courses in law programs around mergers and acquisitions, and so you discuss the incentives for mergers and acquisitions and then cover the legal aspects of it, and so that's where law comes into play. While explicit collusion is illegal, lots of firms do what's called tacit collusion, which is when firms set prices or restrict output without an explicit agreement or explicitly communicating with each other. And that's the key. A good example would be of tacit collusion would be, look, you got two gas stations on a corner at an intersection of two roads, and they're oligopolies. They basically have dominant power in a small town. And so they're watching each other. They're watching the price that they're setting. They're looking at the volume of cars coming in and out in each other's business. And so tacit collusion might be, well, if the guy across the street raises prices, maybe I will, or follow suit, and we'll just agree implicitly that we'll keep prices about the same. Or maybe they agree to keep prices a few pennies apart in terms of gasoline prices, depending on the type of business they're running. Is it more of a convenience store? Is the location ever so slightly better from one part of an intersection to the next? All these things have a play. Now, when you have entrenched firms that have been around for a while in the business, they're more likely to have tacit collusion. And then it takes disruptors, which is an interesting area, new firms, to break that tacit collusion because they see the potential profits that could be being made under tacit collusion. So it's an interesting area of economics. Let me present some quotes from the Justice Department that will put some weight behind these ideas. These quotes are making references to the various cases that the Justice Department has brought. So the first quote is, "We will continue to prosecute those who seek to harm consumers by conspiring to fix prices. It doesn't matter if the products are 50-cent insulated beverage containers," that's a specific reference to a case, "or $1 million pieces of oil field equipment." Again, another specific case. "The results announced today are the latest in a series of charges against defendants filed in the division's ongoing investigation into conspiracies that corrupted the online marketplace and deprived consumers of the benefits of competition. Whether the conspiracy takes place in smoke-filled rooms that are real or virtual, the Department of Justice and its law enforcement partners are committed to uncovering and prosecuting collusion." So there you have it. The self-motivation behind Adam Smith's invisible hand and its ability to help society can sometimes turn on us, and that invisible hand will attempt to pick your pocket. So it's a good thing the DOJ is there to put the brakes on it.